Okay, thanks to you all, and a big welcome on behalf of FMG, our group. And I won't take much time because this is a very interesting subject and panel, so I will leave all the time to Bernard and the panelists. I just have one logistic word to say about how we organize now this so-called Zoom webinar, because for those in our community, I mean the ambassadors and also delegates and other organization representatives, you usually will receive a invitation as a panelist, but it doesn't mean that you are invited to speak, because we just want to make it easy for you to log in as a panelist. So once during the Q&A you want to make a comment or whatever, you can do that immediately without asking for permission. So that's the thing that within this new webinar system. With that, I hope that you're all in, and if okay for you, I would ask you to probably mute yourself. So I'll give floor back to Bernard, and I'll sit back and enjoy the discussion. Bernard, back to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Lou. So thanks to everybody for joining us in this webinar. So as you've seen from the announcement, we're going to be discussing and reflecting on a report that was written by the World Bank, IMF, OECD, UNCTAD. I'm probably missing one anyway, or international organizations on working together for better climate action. So Carolyn Fisher, who is the research manager for sustainability and infrastructure, and who is an environmental economist at the World Bank, is going to kick off with a short presentation of the main messages of the report, the genesis of the report, and whatever she wants to say about the report. And then we have three discussants. Bruno Capuzzi, who is a policy leader fellow at the EUI and is a trade economist from Brazil. Emily Lydgate, who is a professor of environmental law and who was also the deputy director of the Center for Inclusive Trade Policy, so she's trade and environment. And then last but not least, Charles Sable, who is a professor of law and social science at Columbia Law School and who has done a lot of work writing on environmental issues, and actually recently published a book with David Victor called Fixing the Climate. So we have three discussants who have done a lot of thinking and writing about trade, climate, environmental linkages. One of the things I noted when I read the report that none of you is cited, so there's a little problem there, but this is an opportunity for you to say what really should be and should have been addressed in the report. So I'm not going to take any more time. Over to Carolyn, and then we'll just go in the order of Bruno, Emily, and Chuck, and then we'll open it up for quick Q&A, discussions, comments. Carolyn.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I mean, I guess there was a lot of self-referential citing in the report. So yeah, so probably a lot of my own things were cited individually too. So apologies for overlooking the vast.
That was a joke.
But that doesn't mean that there were a lot of intellectual underpinnings for what we're doing. Yeah, so I'll just give a brief overview of this report. It's called Working Together for Better Climate Action, Carbon Pricing Policy Spillovers, and Global Climate Goals. And so this was a joint effort of all of these organizations. So it's, I think it's pretty telling when 5 different international organizations can come together and come to agreement on saying something about climate action and carbon pricing and policy spillovers. So we are observing that, countries now, we're in a phase where everyone needs to scale up climate action if we want to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we see that happening alongside a lot of differences in ambition and policy sequencing and in mitigation approaches. Now, this is both a feature, a critical feature, and perhaps a bug of the Paris Agreement. We see that having this diversity in approaches is critical for obtaining politically feasible mitigation approaches for countries to be able to address distributional concerns and to respect common but differentiated responsibilities. On the other hand, having very heterogeneous policy mixes and having each country making its own nationally determined contributions, we need to recognize that there are cross-border spillover effects of unilateral policy approaches, and we're seeing a lot of potential trade tensions from differences in these approaches. Collectively, we recognize that more is needed to achieve our emission reduction targets in this setting. So in response, the WTO actually initiated this convening of a task force on climate action, carbon pricing, and policy spillovers, which the rest of our organizations joined in this effort. We think this report has 4 key contributions. The first one is really developing a common understanding of carbon pricing metrics. All of our organizations use metrics of carbon pricing, and there are subtle and important differences across them, and different metrics for different uses. So just developing a common understanding of what goes into these metrics is important. The report discusses various insights on what constitutes appropriate mixes of climate change mitigation policies, and also highlighting a pivotal role for carbon pricing. We talk about the analysis of coordination of policies in order to maximize positive spillovers and limit negative spillovers. And we discuss what the role of international organizations may be in that. And finally, we're developing ideas for international coordination to help scale up climate action. Just a little note that this report is focusing on the collective action problem of climate change mitigation and not on climate adaptation, although of course that's a huge issue as well. So what's the state of global climate action? We need more to reach our Paris Agreement goals. According to latest global stocktake, emissions need to fall by 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035 relative to 2019 levels if we are to meet the 1.5 degrees C global warming target. What we observe, though, is an ambition gap. The current NDCs reduce emissions only by 9%. And that's the NDCs. Then we also see an implementation gap, meaning the policies that are in place are only expected to reduce, from a baseline, but it allows emissions to increase by 5% according to IMF calculations. At the same time, we also see a big climate finance gap. We need, according to IMF estimates, a 6-fold increase in global public and private climate finance. So this is in the range of $1 trillion or more for developing and emerging economies. And so what we see happening is a range of policy instruments across countries. And some of this is carbon pricing, and we'll discuss both explicit and implicit methods of carbon pricing. We see other incentive-based policies like renewable energy incentives, energy efficiency incentives. And then we also see a lot of standards and other regulations. At the same time, there are a bunch of studies that demonstrate that low emission pathways can actually help promote economic growth and achieve various sustainable development goals in addition to addressing climate change. So So there is a lot of room for climate action to improve well-being on a number of measures if done well. So this is from an OECD study from 2022, looking at across, these are OECD countries primarily, the different policy mixes that countries are using to approach their climate goals. And, so we see a combination of explicit carbon pricing. I'm sorry if that's like a bit darker than the other blue implicit carbon pricing. And then in green, we see other incentive-based policies. A lot of these are renewable policies. Yellow is other investment, direct investment in infrastructure and other technologies. And then in red, we see standards. So there's still a lot of, regulatory approaches to climate change. And these mixes are pretty heterogeneous across countries. We do see, though, that momentum is building for carbon pricing, and we'll call explicit carbon pricing policies like a carbon tax or an emissions trading system that bases the levy on the emissions content directly. And so we see good growth in these policies. We now have 75 carbon taxes and emissions trading systems around the world, covering nearly a quarter of global emissions. That's a 10 percentage point increase since 2020. While most of these policies are in high-income countries, they are gaining ground in middle-income nations as well. So we look at what the menu of policy tool is a little more specifically. So, we recognize the choice of mitigation instruments is guided by not just simple, cost effectiveness, but for meeting emissions targets. But there are also a variety of other market failures that need to be dealt with. These are including knowledge spillovers, adoption externalities, imperfect information. Policies also have fiscal implications and distributional impacts that that policymakers need to deal with. We do note that there is a central role for carbon pricing in climate change policy packages. Carbon pricing is important because it is the only instrument that actually implements the polluter pays principle, passing on the costs of residual emissions downstream. And this incentivizes changes in consumption patterns and other cost-effective means for reducing emissions. It's also the only policy that generates revenues that then can be recycled for additional climate action or compensation measures for low-income communities or other stakeholders. And finally, achieving a just transition and maintaining political support requires additional policies. So we're very clear-eyed that carbon pricing alone is not sufficient for meeting these goals. There are a variety of reasons for creating a package of different policy instruments, and some of this is behind the heterogeneity that we see. So now carbon pricing metrics. So this is a good chunk of the report going through the different metrics that we have available. So carbon pricing metrics measure the price paid for the emission of greenhouse gases. And they can do this in different ways. So this may be explicit carbon pricing or direct carbon pricing, as some of us call it, or it might be implicit or indirect carbon pricing. So these would be things like fuel, excise taxes, or net of subsidies. Now, carbon prices may be on the margin, so additional emissions might be charged, or on average. So, the degree to which embedded emissions are priced. Now, the having good measures of carbon pricing, it helps inform on how carbon prices shift incentives towards decarbonization, and it can help us understand the level of cross-country variation in average carbon price levels. So we have proposals in the task force related to how we can better unify data collection and focus on commonalities across the different metrics that we have and identify the granular data that's needed to better evaluate international competitiveness impacts. And finally, there's also a set of metrics that are aimed at measuring the impact of policies on emissions. Some of these measure or project the impact of carbon pricing, and some include other policies on emissions. And these are, rather than observed metrics, these are model-based estimates or using elasticities or more complicated economic models. And this table gives you a sense of the different approaches and coverages and uses of these models. And so you might be surprised how long it took to aggregate this and express this in a useful way. But you see that all of our organizations, we're all at least these are primarily IMF, World Bank, and OECD metrics. So we're all gathering data on explicit carbon pricing. The OECD pioneered sort of the net effective carbon rate, which includes implicit carbon pricing. The World Bank built on this in using some different data sources to be able to get a view on a broader spectrum of countries using a sort energy price data and a price gap approach to doing this. So there's some trade-offs in that, top-down versus sort of bottom-up data collection. And then there are a few different approaches for measuring the emissions reductions from different policies. We've got some different models to do that and different approaches towards those calculations. And then finally, you see there are a couple metrics produced by the IMF that are then converting back the sort of effectiveness of these policies back into a carbon price oriented measure. They're calling the effective carbon price. So that is the carbon price that would produce the same emissions reductions as the collection of policies that they're evaluating with their models. So all of these can help inform our understanding of policies and differences, and particularly carbon pricing differences. And this is towards trying to get a better handle of understanding the spillover effects of climate policies. Now we have, general spillover effects that, these are sort of the ones that we're going after with our policies. And the first one, so a spillover effect is with, actions by one country affect other countries as well. And so actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions benefit all countries because we have less global warming. Climate action can help also spur the development and dissemination of green technologies internationally, and it can help shift demand to low emission goods. At the same time, we may have specific spillovers, and the ones I think that create the most tension are really related to competitiveness and carbon leakage. So we note that production-based policies, and in particular carbon pricing, that increase costs can lead to carbon leakage. And we see these consumption-based policies as well that may be standards that would also affect imports, or carbon pricing with border carbon adjustment, or BCAs, that affects the competitiveness of foreign firms and can have spillover effects through trade. And so we discussed this, recognizing some of the tensions of BCAs, discuss some of the pros and cons. So on the pro side, such, well-designed policies can help manage carbon leakage. They buttress domestic support for carbon pricing, and they can stimulate demand pull for low carbon production abroad. On the other hand, part of what they do is they shift the incidence of carbon pricing abroad, which can adversely impact low-income countries. Low-income countries in particular may have less capacity to comply, and these policies can have additional compliance costs beyond just the implicit tariff of the embodied emissions costs. And there's enough tension around that they're at risk tit for tat measures. So we're arguing for improved coordination to try to manage these cross-border impacts. And as a first step, we need to develop a common understanding of cross-border spillovers, what they are and their impacts, to help countries better cope with the spillovers. It'd be helpful to have a greater alignment of carbon intensities. And a big first step, though, is really just the alignment of product-specific emission metrics or benchmarks to help reduce compliance costs for firms engaged in international trade, so they're not having to monitor and report for too many different policies. And then, we can have coordination on focused technology dissemination to help accelerate the climate transition and reduce emissions disparities. And fourthly, towards this end, a common understanding for the implementation of trade-related climate measures can help avoid unjustifiable discrimination, avoid excess compliance costs, and reduce the risk of trade tensions. Then there's some ideas to coordination, like bigger opportunities to scale up climate action through coordination. First of all, we note that all of our international organizations are providing support for climate policy. So we provide technical assistance, capacity building, a lot of analytical work, and also, certainly in the case of the World Bank, climate finance. Yet there are several options to scale up climate action, and we go back to these gaps to think about how we can address them. So one is the transparency gap. We need to agree on enhanced reporting and transparency that can help compare contributions and help increase ambition itself, and just in terms of transparency. Then there's still an implementation gap. So if we can agree on policies, sectoral measures, or a policy mix to pave the way for enhanced use of policies, and in particular carbon pricing. And there may be a way to start with regional initiatives for this. And then finally, the broader ambition gap, coordinating on enhanced ambition in the next round of NDCs, potentially by a subgroup, well, still aligned with the Paris process, but getting a smaller, more tractable group to focus on ambition. Or we can, there are proposals for greater implementation or negotiation around carbon pricing or equivalence policies. So we have potential further joint work that we've been talking about. So I think a first step is we still need more granular and better data, particularly on embedded carbon prices, which you need to deal in this world of emerging border carbon adjustments and the carbon content of trade. We need further elaboration of the calculation of equivalent carbon prices, if these are being used as a measure of appropriate policy responses. There can be further analysis on the impact of domestic climate policies on other countries. So this is informing the spillover effects. There's analysis on the cost of fragmentation of climate policies and the design of border adjustment policies and their interoperability. Given the heterogeneous nature of different climate policies, including carbon pricing policies, the implementation of these border measures is not going to be identical, but we hope that the key aspects can at least be interoperable. And we want to identify solutions to promote and facilitate green technology and know-how diffusion. And finally, a comprehensive analysis of approaches to address the spillover effects and scale up climate action and ways to ensure a just transition. So thank you there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks a lot for that, Carolyn. It was very useful, especially for those who have not read the report, just taking us through it. So let's just start with Bruno, and then we'll just go down the list, Bruno, Emily, and Charles, to reflect on what they've heard, but also I think it will be useful to also kind of have, or at least start a discussion in terms of, what could be done to actually foster more of this coordination and cooperation. That is a theme of the report. So, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Bernard, and thank you very much, Caroline, for this comprehensive introduction to the report for us. I will time myself to make sure that I stay here within the guidelines. And well, I heard with appreciation the importance that was given for cooperation and joint multilateral efforts to design, but especially to implement these environmental related trade measures. I will, however, here bring my intervention the focus a little bit on the problematics of two specific EU unilateral measures that not just, in my perspective, the risk to jeopardize the climate action in third countries. I think that Caroline mentioned like the risk of fragmentation of these actions, but the implementation they bring also problems and some possibilities that they don't seem to be there at the surface. So I'm going to talk a little bit on a production-oriented measure, which is I'm going to focus on the CBAM. And I will draft some comments as well on the EUDR, which is a consumption-oriented measure. Sorry. So yeah, on the report that we just saw from Caroline, we see some possible positive and negative spillover effects from border and carbon adjustment, such as the CBAM. And I would like to bring, before I discuss two of these spillover, I'd like to bring a little bit on the perspective on the multilateral system, on how it sits with the multilateral order and with the international commitments that the EU that's in the implementing actor and the other players that are within. So one could perceive the multilateral aspect of it from either a WTO perspective, on a UNF to CCC perspective. I will look on environmental law perspective, so the UNF to CCC. And I will present why I understand that it should fall 100% within UNFCCC and therefore CBDR, the Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. We see that the CBAM as a byproduct of the EU's NDCs with the Paris Agreement. And so as we know, the EU has the target to diminish emissions by 55% by 2030. And among the options, the policy options that have been implemented for reaching the 55% target, the EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme, has been this year accelerated from 2% of reductions a year to 4% of reductions a year, which is expected to lead to an increase of prices of the allowances within the European carbon market. And because the European Commission works with the hypothesis of carbon leakage, and I can come back afterwards why I call it a hypothesis. It's loosely supported by data in the impact assessment of the CBAM itself. Okay, you have to go to the second annex on the last page. The Commission accepts that ex ante and ex post studies, they do not agree that we don't have data supporting the carbon leakage as a fact. So that's why I say the Commission works with the hypothesis of carbon leakage. CBAM was designed to bring back competitiveness to European producers that's expected to lose some competitiveness with the increase of the prices of allowances within the EU ETS, with the acceleration again of the ETS, in detriment of the EU's NDCs with Paris. Therefore, CBAM comes as a byproduct of EU's commitments, which in international law, if the acceleration of EU ETS is understood as a first-order responsibility of the EU, the CBAM that targets indirect emissions that are affected indirected to EU's commitments is a second-order responsibility. Therefore, CBAM is within should be understood within Paris, within UNFCCC. Therefore, should follow 100% CBDR and these dispositions. Here, I want to make another comment on why CBDR should be really taken seriously when we look at the CBAM, because several studies, they indicate that the most exposed countries to CBAM, some of them, they are least developing countries, and a lot of them, they're actually in Africa, because by being exposed means that the products that they export, they are within the scope of CBAM to the EU, they have a bigger representativeness in their exporting agenda. So one might argue that CBAM was designed targeting exporter A or B, but if you look at the data, the most exporting countries are going to be least developing countries, and a lot of them are in the African continent. So the CBAM, by applying the same price for carbon to all countries, would be in breach of CBDR. Here, I would like to make a link to some of the positive spillovers that this type of measures are deemed to bring, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions overall through the partners. Here, I would like to comment, yes, but that depends on which emissions we are talking about. Are we talking about the emissions that countries planned within their NDCs and within their mitigation plans? Well, remembering that countries, they are sovereign to discriminate in which sector they're going to reduce their emissions to meet their targets? Or are we aiming to reduce emissions in those sectors the EU wants countries to lower because they are included in CBAM? So if we go to that door, and then if we would expect that exporters in Africa would lower their emissions in those sectors that the EU chose, and the EU is applying that, one could go on to the door on the extraterritoriality application of one EU perspective to that. And again, I think that it makes sense that these sectors, they are included in CBAM, because in the EU, 2/3 of emissions, they come from energy-related industry or transport. So it makes sense that these sectors, they are targeted to reach EU's NDCs, but for other countries, especially those with higher mix of renewables in their energy grid, it might not be the case. They might meet 100% their NDCs by lowering emissions in other sectors. But if they happen to export aluminum, steel, fertilizer, or any of the products within the CBAM, they will have to pay to enter the European market if they happen to export to the EU. And although the European Parliament made an official position requiring the Commission to redirect the fund collected from CBAM to least developing countries to mitigation processes, the European Commission has decided to move this money to the Innovation Fund to fund mitigation technologies investments in the EU, which would be a bigger breach of CBDR if we would like to see in that way. Another element on still on my question, which emissions are we talking about? CBAM will target only tier 1 emissions, which means emissions at factory level, not looking at tier 2, which are the emissions on the generation of the energy. And we know that these emissions, they are as important as if not more, of the energies at the factory level. And why CBAM does that? Because industrial energy in the EU is heavily subsidized. So if the CBAM would go to implement also to the tier 2 in the same way, free allowances, we're going to phase out. The subsidies we're going to also to phase out or to be abolished. And I don't think that this is a political game. Member states and the commissions, they are decided to negotiate or to buy this game. And the third and last point I would like to bring on what emissions are we talking about is that if you look to the documents that are published now, that are available, it's still quite unclear what's going to be the baseline, the benchmark for charging CBAM. There is this aspirational goal of charging the actual level of embedded emissions from each producer, which, if you talk to people in Brussels, if you read the documents, it's unclear. It's that typical vague language from the European Commission to give it enough margin of maneuver to the implemented acts. We all understand how this game works. But there are many people that defend that because there's not going to be a trust system on like the emissions that are being declared now in the transition phase, on how we're going to see the coordination. We saw a little bit on Caroline's speech, the difficulty to coordinate carbon pricing. Imagine the difficulty to coordinate the emissions embedded in each producer in each country. So some people defend that you should and will apply a standardized level of emissions to all the foreign products based on the level of emissions to produce that product within the EU, because that also would ring fence and safeguard the EU from breaching GATT Article 1. Because if you charge countries differently, you could easily try to create a case and bring it that you are in breach of GATT. So like to prevent that, the basis of emissions of EU producer will be applied to foreign products, which in my perspective is a big problem of effectiveness, because if a producer happens to emit less because it has 100% of renewable or had invested in mitigation before, this producer will have to pay more if the benchmark at the EU level is higher, or in most cases, since the EU is expected to diminish its emissions because of the acceleration of ETS, foreign producers that emit more, they will be paying less. They will be paying the level of the benchmark of the EU. So in neither scenario, these producers will have any incentives to invest in mitigation, to reduce emissions from the energy generation, because they will be either worse off or better off in any case. So then the question of effectiveness in CBAM when it comes to implementing it and actually seeing the gains would be challengeable, would be a problem. My last comment in this first intervention, to not extrapolate too much of my time, is what another positive spillover brought, that's the creation of incentives for other countries to apply their own carbon markets in their own jurisdictions, what some scholars call the carbon club. So the defenders of this approach is that instead of paying CBAM certificates by having a carbon pricing in their own jurisdictions, the money paid will stay within their countries, and then therefore this amount would be deducted when this product would be exported from the EU perspective into the EU. A big problem here. As far as CBAM is concerned, it's not important how many tons of carbon you paid in your market. What's important, the financial sum that you paid. So if a least developed country developed their own carbon market, the price of ton of carbon is not going to be the same in the EU. So if I pay 1 carbon in the FDC, it's going to be much less than paying this 1 carbon in the EU. The amount paid in the exporting country will have to be converted and deducted from what European producers paid in euro for that carbon on the price of carbon of the EU. So even if me in a developing or least developing country pay 100% of my emissions, my financial sum will never be the same in euros. So I still have to pay more. So as far as CBAM is concerned, paying 1 ton of carbon is not as important as paying €1. So that many critics of CBAM, they started calling it as a competitiveness measure instead of an environmental measure, because it's not enough to pay the carbon. You have to pay the same amount as the European producers are paying, because as it was announced, it's idea to level up the competitiveness to avoid carbon leakage. I think I will quit my comments from the EUDR, and I will stop here because I've extrapolated. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruno. Okay, so that's a clear call for a lot more coordination and cooperation needed on how this thing would actually be implemented. Emily.
Thanks, Bernard. I'm really happy to have the chance to read the report and offer some comments. Those of us who have attended a fair few of these trade and climate discussions know that the same themes do tend to come up. So my qualitative summary is that the most common 3 themes are First of all, the silos between trade and climate policy and the need to address these issues in a more integrated way. Second of all, the fragmentation of institutions, standards, and regulations. And third, the exclusion of or negative spillovers, if you like, affecting developing countries from the unilateral climate action of developed countries and how to address this issue. So I think, this report, it's full of useful data and charts, which I really appreciated and we'll call upon. But more fundamentally, just having these major international organizations that are active on these issues come together and ask, how do we think about them? How do we frame them? What's in our toolkit to measure and understand them? And how can we bring our approaches together is itself an important part of addressing institutional fragmentation. So, I hope that you are able to pursue those future research agendas that you set out. And I thought I would share a couple thoughts on the contributions of the report and also to respond to Bernard's prompt of what can be done to foster coordination and cooperation. So I wanted to say something on two interrelated areas. First, the pursuit of unified metrics for measuring and pricing emissions, and second, trade facilitation. So on the metrics, I should be clear, the technical side of this is not my area. But I read with interest the different approaches to calculating, for example, explicit and implicit charges and thinking about how to create a unified approach there. And I think, we should keep in mind that these types of metrics are used for a lot of reasons. But as soon as a metric is embedded into regulation, in other words, as soon as the application of a particular metric becomes necessary to secure market access, then it becomes a potential trade barrier. And I think this is, in a sense, building on some of the things that Bruno was commenting on, in the importance of what might be described as process legitimacy for establishing metrics. I think a problem we're having right now in the trade space is the dissemination of metrics through unilateral regulation. So one example of that would be CBAM. So the EU has developed a way of measuring and pricing embodied emissions. This could de facto or de jure, let's wait and see, spread to the UK. Then we could have the US come up with its own way of doing things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think where this leads us is, back to something that the WTO has been talking about for a long time, which is international standards, the importance of international standards in regulatory requirements, which can meet better, at least, these concerns about process legitimacy and who's making standards, but also make it a lot easier for firms to trade. The WTO members have developed codes and principles for standards development, and these types of multilateral discussions about standards governance in the WTO seem to be important here. But of course, and getting back to Carolyn's initial framing, which I really liked, and I will probably steal, that diversity is both a feature and a bug of the Paris Agreement and UNFCCC. Even if countries arrive miraculously at a single recognized, globally respected way of calculating, for example, how many emissions a particular sector in a particular country generates, and how much a particular country is charging its domestic industry for these emissions, then you get right into another problem, which is how to differentiate this burden to reflect CBDR. So this problem to me seems very, very difficult to solve, but certainly just having a common basis to have the conversation is an important preparatory step for that. History does show us that it is very difficult to achieve international cooperation on regulation or on a government-to-government level. And I think that leads to the second point I wanted to put on the table, and I'm interested in others' views and how this is reflected in the international trade and climate agenda, which is trade facilitation, and really kind of broadly conceived, which seems to me that should be a really core and central priority of trade and climate cooperation, which is perhaps, underemphasized. So, just broad context for this, we know we need a lot more trade in goods that support the low carbon transition. If we just look at, critical minerals, for example, I think we have to mine more copper in the next 22 years than in the whole history of humanity beforehand, or something like that. So this might suggest, that the classical intuition of, we should lower trade barriers, we should diversify our supply chains, etc. But instead, of course, what's happening is exactly the opposite. We have more tariffs, we have supply chain restrictions, we have an explosion of new regulatory requirements of the types that Bruno was discussing, that, address all these deforestation, embodied carbon, etc. So what this means is we need to trade, if we can't resolve or get rid of these trade barriers, we need to trade smarter. And I think there are three dimensions of this I'd highlight. The first one is related to what I said before, is better cooperation between regulation and standards. We have this increasingly cluttered and complex regulatory environment. And all these new regulatory requirements also mean, supporting the net zero transition, also mean that regulation is extending into areas which were previously mostly governed by voluntary sustainability standards and certification schemes. So I think there needs to be a lot more discussion about how compliance with standards can help firms comply with unilateral regulation. And actually, the EU CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is an example where greenhouse gas accounting standards, including ISO standards, are built into the compliance. The second is just the more classical trade facilitation agenda, digitization, transparency, et cetera, how to streamline the process of getting stuff across borders. And the final element of this is capacity building. In other words, making sure that exporters are actually able to meet the requirements of importing countries, particularly developing countries, so that we can actually make these regulations effective and help them green global supply chains instead of just throwing up market access barriers and creating trade diversion. So I think this report is a great step in helping, propel the momentum in these discussions, and thanks again for inviting me to join.
Thanks, Emily. Very clear. So last but not least, over to Charles.
Hi, and thanks for having me. Apologies for being blacked out. I'm very nearsighted, and when I stare into the screen, I produce an effect on the other side, which I'm reliably assured is disconcerting. So it's not the love of mystery that cloaks me here. So on this report, I might have a slightly discordant reaction, and that could be helpful just in introducing a somewhat different perspective into the conversation. To me, this report is a little betwixt and between. It's most of it is concerned with carbon pricing and CBAM, and is just a straightforward continuation of the idea that the way to really deal with climate change is by getting a social price of carbon to an adequate level, and having the price mechanism largely determine the adjustment process. Now, that hasn't worked for a very long time. We all know that. That's why Paris happened. The Kyoto agreements trying to institute an economically rational version of that. So to deal with free riding by the imposition of firm obligations globally, that Kyoto was supposed to do that, and I won't describe the Kyoto mechanisms. They didn't work. Subsequent efforts to introduce carbon pricing mechanisms have been extremely vexed. There's a whole literature on how efforts to do that generally go in. They wind up. People look desperately to find ways of making them look less like taxes, and then reapportioning the proceeds of the tax. But you know all of this, and then the problems with emission trading are legion. And I say this not because the idea is bad. The idea is makes perfect sense, but it has proved unfeasible, and that's why Paris happened. That's why the people moved away from Kyoto and adopted a system which, as this conversation accurately reports, was essentially bottom up in leaving to the sovereign states the right to choose how and in what measure they would meet self-imposed commitments. And the result of that is a bunch of good efforts, but something which is uncoordinated. And now comes a report that says, okay, here's how to coordinate it, or not, or one in a long line of reports. And the idea for coordination largely goes back to, well, let's do what we set out to do before any of all this happened. And of course, you can always find little green shoots of carbon markets that are doing better, but so that's on the one hand. That's the betwixt part. The between part is that when the report does start to actually, by chapter 6, when it starts talking about coordination, suddenly the discussion shifts to these very nebulous things called sectoral and regional initiatives. There's even a mention a couple of times of industrial policy. I mean, literally a couple of times in the whole report. And what's peculiar about that is, I mean, everything that's said in the report is accurate, but what is omitted from the report is that there has been a massive shift in the direction of these kinds of policies in the last few years, and in reaction to many developments, not primarily an intellectual revolt against climate pricing, but in reaction to many different elements. And so that now, in fact, decarbonization efforts are largely centered in the sorts of initiatives which are at national and international level, largely sectoral, sometimes regional, which are more at the periphery than the center of the report, or more in the center only in the sense that when it comes to actually talking about doing stuff now, a lot of the discussion points in that direction. Now, that brings us to things like the CBAM and EUDR, and a series of measures which are putting the new situation very dramatically before us in a way I don't think is captured by the report. If I'm wrong about that, and I'm not sufficiently versed in the subtleties of the form of communication, happy to be corrected. But what's going on is with the EUDR is that after long efforts to establish find a kind of a multilateral, a dialogic, let's call it, deliberative decision about how to adjust growing practices in green commodity producers and the desires of the EU. The EU came to the unilateral imposition of some rules, and the rules, insofar as there's a set of rules in the EU in the directive, which are just a bunch of unilateral requirements, and then alongside of that, there are efforts to create a CBAM, and with all the difficulties that have been indicated about pricing. And the EU policy is not coherent. I'm not trying to say the EU has solved the problem. Far from it. What it's doing is showing the absence of a global structure for addressing the problem along the lines that have been suggested in the report, and the fact that entities like the EU are no less subject to anybody else, and they're thrashing around, I think is the only way to say it, in search of a solution. Now, the question arises: what is it exactly? And let me use this point in the discussion to elaborate for a second of what I think the alternative approach, if it goes well, is pointing towards. So the report characterizes the EU measures as with respect to CBAM and implicitly the EUDR. It characterizes them as measures affecting consumer behavior. That's a deep mischaracterization, I hope, because what the EU is trying to do is not, I hope, is not satisfy the moral yearnings of EU citizens not to partake of goods tainted by deforestation. What it's trying to do is actually create a system that does two things. It wants to induce foreign suppliers to adopt policies that are good for the planet, and it wants to protect investors in the EU who are investing in carbon emissions reductions, which make goods more expensive and therefore would be subject to competition from dirty producers. So both of these seem like completely laudable goals, and the problem is aligning them and making sure that the way the EU imposes these obligations actually leads to improvements in productivity and sustainability on the part of the producers, so that they can meet the needs of the globe and the EU in a way that doesn't shift the share, unfairly shift the share of the burden onto them. I would hope that a report focusing on the lack of coordination between these many policies and so on would have something to say about that kind of a process. It's not a criticism of the reports. As Carolyn said at the beginning, it's a wonder that these international organizations could get together and produce a document where they begin to reconcile their differences. Most of those differences do have to do with these indicators and metrics and the infernally difficult business of really trying to make carbon pricing work. I'm the last person who thinks that it's a simple problem obstructed only by politics. The problem itself is very difficult, as was indicated by prior discussion. So let me leave it there. I was a little taken aback at the report because it's the fact that it exists is a testament to how seriously the international organizations are taking climate after a long period where this was not at the top of the agenda. That's commendable. It's necessary, and at the same time, slightly bewildered at the fact that the discussion, though useful in detail, was conceptually framed in a way that I think is manifestly behind the politics that are shaping actual decision in this area.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. So I think kind of a common theme, Carolyn, that you've heard is lots of need for actual coordination and cooperation. And the question is, what we're actually seeing is a lot of unilateralism, especially in the part of the world that I'm sitting in the EU. I think Emily's solution is partly, focus more on international standardization and see where you can agree on standards, including standards for metrics. But I think one way of paraphrasing what Charles has said, and I think also what Bruno was saying a bit, is, where in an absolute sense do you actually find space or an interest or an effort to actually engage with everyone on what those metrics might be, what the standards might be, what solutions might be to what are clearly common problems. as opposed to the way Emily put it, where we're sitting in silos. And I think Brussels is very much a silo in this regard, where everybody is talking to each other and not really thinking about how does this impact on the rest of the world, or asking the question, what can we actually do to help the rest of the world achieve their own objectives in this area, as opposed to us dictating to them what they should be doing. So that's a kind of my sense of where we are. So what I'll give Carolyn the floor to kind of reflect a bit on what she's heard, just a few minutes. And then if you want to raise questions, comments, disagree vehemently with what has been said, please raise your hand and I'll give people the floor to intervene. So Caroline, take 2 minutes because I think we should have a discussion. If there's no discussion, I'll come back to you.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And maybe I should start with a disclaimer that I am here as a researcher and not officially representing my organization, much less all of these international organizations. I wanted to sort of discuss the report and a bit of my insights in the process and stuff. So I appreciate this discussion. And there were a lot of really good comments, and this sort of also reflective of a lot of the discussions that we had, because we're a lot of different people with different perspectives. I didn't want to get too caught up in the CBAM. We didn't want this to be about the CBAM, but it is it is a policy that is prompting a lot of these discussions and a lot of these needs and ideas for greater coordination, because it's emblematic, as Charles said, it's emblematic of what happens with the lack of coordination. But we see, different perspectives even among the IOs on border carbon adjustments, and it can be, shaped by your point of view. And so you mentioned, so is a BCA a unilateral measure? From what perspective do you take that in? Under Paris, all policies and nationally determined contributions are unilateral measures. And so from some perspective, BCA is a companion to a unilateral carbon pricing measure. So what do we take as the unilateral measure? So we see, UNCTAD has a recent analysis of BCA, taking the perspective that the carbon pricing policies are given, then what are the impacts of BCAs? We've at the World Bank, we have, for our exposure index, we're looking at, BCA as accompanying the phase out and free allocation in the EU ETS to pass on these costs to EU consumers. And so recognizing that exporters to the EU will to some extent get price compensation because more of these costs will be passed on in higher prices. So really what affects your competitiveness is your relative emissions intensity compared to EU producers. You can find, so some less developed countries, and there aren't that many least developed countries that are that exposed. There are a few if they're exporting these very emissions intensive goods, but you see many least developed countries might benefit from the EU CBAM or border adjustments because they drive down the international prices of emissions intensive goods and also of energy. So, there can be a lot of lenses on this. The OECD has a study of the CBAM that looks at the net effect of the increase in ambition as well as the phase out and free allocation and the BCA. So, so navigating these different perspectives, I think they all need to be respected, but it is emblematic of what we're seeing and how important it is, as Emily said, to start coordinating at least on a lot of these metrics before they get embedded in too many different policies, because we're seeing proliferation starting, and so we should come together and think about from international standards for doing these measures, and that is happening. So I'm in Paris the past couple of days, the Inclusive Forum for Climate Mitigation Approaches was meeting at the OECD, and a big work stream there has been on measuring emissions intensity. Now we also need to, think of standards for measuring, to operationalize these, measuring carbon pricing for these purposes, and measuring embedded carbon pricing. We don't have the data for that yet. So there are a lot of opportunities for greater sort of incremental coordination. And then, Charles noticed that, we had to get, we got a little vague on some of these ideas for like coordination around bigger ambition. I think this gets tricky because in some sense, it's like trying to find a metric. What is a reasonable metric for evaluating what is reasonable effort, respecting common but differentiated responsibilities, and should that be a carbon pricing conversion metric? Should that just be emissions? Should this work inform emissions? That is something that hasn't been able to be resolved yet. So, but I think Charles observes well that a lot of the approaches now towards mitigation, they're really sectorally focused. So I'm actually personally more optimistic about having international coordination on sectoral approaches rather than economy-wide policy approaches or country-to-country emissions trading, which we see hasn't really worked. But we have seen, we are seeing the spread of carbon pricing itself. And I don't think the problem isn't necessarily the instrument. The only G20 countries without some form of carbon pricing now are Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the US. So this policy is, these policies are spreading. But we need to get a vision of sort of international coordination and enabling better use of carbon pricing that isn't necessarily the old Kyoto ideas.
Okay, thanks. So I have Ignacio and I think Lou, correct me if I'm wrong. And there's also, for the people on the panel, check the chat, because there are there's a question in the chat. So I don't think people who are attendees can actually speak unless they become a panelist. But anyways, if you write your questions in the chat, we'll respond to them. So Ignacio.
No, thanks a lot, Bernard. It's a fascinating topic. And I will try, however, to be as brief as I can. Because in my view, there's an important to distinguish two issues. One is what it is that can be done in the WTO on this whole issue of carbon leakage, carbon pricing, and what is the nature of the problem that requires cooperation. Now, if it comes to what can be done in the WTO, realistically speaking, I tend to think that what Emily has pointed out is perhaps probably the maximum that is achievable in the WTO at this point in time. Some discussion to try to see where it's possible to have some convergence about standards for measuring the carbon emission, and some discussion about possible trade facilitation steps. I mean, I'm a strong believer in the legitimacy of CBAM, in the legitimacy of the policy, but I would certainly agree that it should be possible to achieve those objectives in a manner which is more trade facilitative. So I think having those kind of discussions somewhere in the WTO, not sure where it is the CTE, not sure where it is the TBT committee, but somewhere in the WTO, I tend to think that that could be hopefully possible if one can move away from legalistic and not very productive discussions. Now, the problem, however, it is much broader and requires thinking about where you can actually do cooperation, because at the end of the day, the fundamental problem is no way that you are going to get to net zero unless you find some way of decarbonizing some sectors which are highly internationally traded. I mean, the EU has not chosen arbitrarily the sectors which are covered by the CBAM. It happens to be sectors which are subject to carbon pricing and which are highly internationally traded. So you need to look how you can actually try to coordinate policies on the decarbonization of those sectors. And basically speaking, I think there are only two potential approaches. One is the sectorial approach, which was mentioned by Caroline, which is probably going to have to be based on standards, agreeing on the standards of carbon intensity that progressively take you to net zero. But if you follow that approach, you immediately are going to be facing the problem that the instruments that you follow have very different impact in your domestic producers. It is not the same if you subsidize your domestic producer to make an investment, that if you require them to make an investment through a standard, or that if you apply to them a carbon price that they have to pay even if they have made the investment. So the impact of the three different types of instruments is very different, and therefore a standard approach to coordinating policies is always going to be very challenging because of that reason. Now, the other question that, of course, that has been mentioned by you, Caroline, there are 70 countries at this point in time that are applying the carbon price, very heterogeneous, very different the carbon price. In my view, it would make a lot of sense to have a forum somewhere where those countries could discuss interoperability of their carbon pricing schemes, not because there's an obligation to introduce a carbon price, but because since all of those countries have making that choice, it would make sense, rather than this is decided unilaterally by someone, that you discuss how these different regimes can be made, recognized, and be made interoperable. Now, I don't really think, however, that that's a discussion that is going to be possible to take place in the WTO. But it's a place where that discussion can take place, I do not know. But I think, in my view, again, it's a discussion that would make sense to make it somewhere.
Okay, thanks, Ignacio. Lou, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I just want to follow on what Ignacio just said about how to connect this very valuable report to what WTO can do, and also, of course, on which FMG is very much focused on. I think that right now WTO has CTE trying to do a lot, and then we do have a series of plurilateral initiatives going on, plastic, on fossil fuel, and on the other aspects. But I'm not sure how they are kind of coordinated in a way, or they are very much, as said, working in their own silos. The last thing I want to say, as I sent to you, Bernard, is that recently, I think 4 countries, Switzerland, Costa Rica, Chile, New Zealand, and others, Iceland, have signed this agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability. Very interestingly, they said specifically that this agreement, ACCTS, is not part of the WTO, but it is drafted in accordance with the WTO. And of course, it says that it has a kind of objective to expand to further members, and then to tackle all the things on environmental goods, services, fossil, e-labeling, and others. Also, it has an element on dispute settlement. So, quite putting this together, I just wonder whether panelists or other participants of the audience who maybe share more insights on what the members are trying to do, or whether they can do something more than what they're doing now. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So we can come back to the ACCTS. I don't know whether you've had a chance to read the question, but essentially the question is, how do we deal with geopolitics, which doesn't really appear in the report? I wonder why. But then the more substantive dimension was, well, okay, so what's the scope for kind of plurilateral, subgroups of countries to actually cooperate on some of these dimensions? And I think the ACCTS, this Agreement on Climate Change, Trade, and Sustainability, is one kind of example of that. I think it's pretty unique. I think it's going to be very difficult to expand that to a lot more countries, in part because it has been designed to be MFN, right? So the tariff liberalization, the liberalization of trade and environmental services in that agreement will be applied on an MFN basis. And clearly, if you put that forward on the table to trade negotiators like Ignacio used to be, and you tell them, well, this is what the EU should do, then, this is obviously something where you'd be giving away a lot in mercantilist terms and not clearly getting something back. So anyway, but that was the question. Where is the scope for the plurilateral? Is there a lot of scope for doing that? So if anybody wants to take that up, Chuck,
Bernard, could I?
Emily?
Yeah, could I take
Chuck,
a
go
shot?
ahead.
Unless Emily wants to.
No,
So
go ahead, Chuck.
Okay, so let
Go
me
ahead.
take a shot. This follows on things that Ignacio and Bruno were saying. So I think the area where there'll be room for pilot projects, projects that are both address these problems in their immediately and can serve as models or attraction points for broader efforts to rethink the relation between plurilateral initiatives and the standard WTO MFN procedures. So I think that to put it in very spare terms, I think that the infinite implementation problems associated with both establishing national carbon trading systems, carbon tax systems, price adjustment mechanisms, and then finding melding those into an international system with adequate exchange rates, and doing that at a level that captures the real emissions of, you know, that focuses the incidence of the price increase on the polluters in the crucial places doing the crucial things, and encourages development of alternative technologies. I think when you add all those problems together, the chances of getting a solution through a CBAM mechanism are very next to zero. So that's why I think, as I said, there are these sectoral initiatives, and as Ignacio was saying, and these tend to be located in these carbon intensive industries, because that's where the investments are going, the massive investments to reduce the carbon intensivity of production. And that's where producers need to be protected. And then the extension of that is something like the EUDR, where you, instead of imposing the burden on EU producers, you impose the adjustment burden on the developing country agricultural commodity producers. But the goal is the same. You're offering them a protected market in the EU. If they meet the traceability and other requirements, then they get the benefit of operating under an EU imposed protectionist barrier and can recover their additional costs. Okay. Now, where do the groups come in? Well, actually figuring out how to write the rules, the standards that should cover what, let's call them carbon. Let's say that there are going to be green carbon clubs by industry. So there'll be a carbon club in steel, there'll be a carbon club in coffee, a carbon club in soy, and it will consist of the producers and large consuming countries that are determined to bring down emissions in those sectors, and do it in a way which addresses the source of the pollution problems by inducing a change in the production methods that's both more sustainable and economically viable for the people in the zone impacted. So that, because otherwise it won't happen. I mean, that's the reality of it. If you don't take account of the people upon whom you're posing giant costs of adjustment, they won't adjust. So that's all right. Now, you can see that the EU, in fact, was close to had started down the road in the direction of creating, in a very awkward way, taking account of the then prevailing WTO sensibilities. We're talking about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. The EU was engaged in negotiations with producers of forest products and then other commodities, but chiefly forest products, trying to establish a domestic foreign code that would work on the sustainability, productivity criteria I mentioned, and produce low emissions. And it came close to working in some places like Indonesia. It had a lot of trouble and people got impatient, and they've now, but the point is, the reason to introduce this is not to say go back to what they were doing then, but rather this idea has been hanging in the air. And if you try to implement these measures unilaterally, that's the example of the EUDR, you see it doesn't work, because you don't even know how to define a forest in a way which captures what is environmentally dangerous about practices in Brazil or Indonesia. The FAO forest does not cover a lot of the dangerous Brazilian practices, and it doesn't, and for that matter, it doesn't allow the Brazilians to take credit for restoring degraded lands, which you would also want under a. So that's just an illustration of the fact that it's almost inconceivable that you can have a set of standards that would be both consensual, agreeable to the party that's going to have to bear the burden of the cost, and actually meet the climate goals, unless they're negotiated by between the countries and producers and consumers involved. That's a feasible thing, and that's where I'm guessing you'll see the first actual development of these green clubs. The steel discussions, which are stalled and shrouded in secrecy, have recurrently have elements of this. After fighting about who's going to get the best protectionist measure, there's real discussion about who's emitting what and what standards green steel should meet, and then second, how to open the green steel club to new members who are not currently part of the discussion, because you don't want a closed club, you want an open club. So from the WTO point of view, on one hand, the openness is welcome, but the fact that club members could be able to charge tariffs to non-complying non-members would obviously cause WTO problems. But we're in a period where many actors have decided it's best to go ahead and experiment and worry about WTO compatibility later. So I'm sorry for the long answer. I do think things are going in this sectoral direction. I do think that the choices already made are pushing in the direction of formation of these climate clubs. I do think that they could be a vehicle for WTO reform if there's a way of making clear that through technical assistance and through their inherent openness to new members who can accede to the requirements, that they are elements of broader rule-based trade and not protectionism. But doing all that would be helped by a perspective of the international financial institutions that more explicitly took account of the developments immediately before us.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. Emily, you want to come in?
Just quickly on plurilaterals. I mean, plurilaterals are the new multilaterals. I mean, it seems to be what's here and what's happening. And Bernard, I know you've done a lot of thinking about this as well, so interested to hear your views. But I think we need to ask, how do we evaluate whether they're good and what ends are they serving? So if you're thinking about it from does this lead to multilateral movement, then if you have an open plurilateral where everyone's just multilaterally, reducing their tariffs on green goods, like the EGA model, or maybe agreeing to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, that to me doesn't seem like a particular barrier to multilateral progress. But if you have a climate club where everyone in the climate club agrees that they're going to impose tariffs against non-members, then you might say, well, that could be effective for in other ways, and this is up for debate. It could be effective for climate action, but it will be more contentious and divisive for the international trade system.
No, I think that's definitely that's true. So I think one of the things I was thinking about, and where I know we're running out of time, and and it's clearly unfair to put Carolyn on the spot for all this stuff as just one of many, many, many co-authors of this report, and obviously just one institution. But I do think there is a role to play by the international organizations to actually create platforms for the kind of thing that Chuck was talking about. And that is not really happening in the WTO, right? So potentially that could happen in the WTO, but obviously there's a lot of technical expertise associated with these issues, and that's very clear from the report in terms of, measuring carbon, all these metrics, etc. So I think what's missing is a venue. And I think if we think about plurilateral versus multilateral, insofar as we go down this sectoral route, by definition, it's not going to be of interest or relevance to 166 WTO members, right? So I think just because of that, you're going to be thinking about groups of countries. I think going back to the old GATT notion of principal suppliers, I mean, who really has skin in this game? Who is affected? That will automatically bring down the number of countries involved in efforts to actually create these kinds of club. But my takeaway from the report was, yes, you need a lot of coordination, what is called coordination in the report, but I didn't see a sense of, hey, we're here to help support a process, right? And Emily talked about process legitimacy. I think I see some of the regional development banks doing more of that than the international ones, but I think it's something that's really kind of, for me, it was missing in the report. And I think there's a real need for that. I mean, as Charles was quite articulate about. Okay, Bruno, I'll give you the last word, and then we have to shut it down.
Thank you, Bernard. It's going to be very quick. I would like just to resonate a little bit on something that Charles mentioned that also connects with something that you mentioned now. That I see that about EUDR, what was mentioned, that is not a consumer-oriented policy, but like an attempt to influence policies in exporting countries. I think that one way to go that we could use this cooperation approach is to be discussing equivalencies of outcome-based solutions instead of applying an horizontal measure that fits all. And as Charles was mentioning, some sectoral policies could be implemented, and I could think of a few examples of those commodities of the EUDR in Brazil, okay, which is the country that are no better, that they have certified schemes of deforestation-free for batch of productions that could be 100% certified and verifiable, but they are not sufficient for complying with the EUDR, the regulation. The regulation is more. The regulation requires more than the actors already on the ground they do and accept internationally. So I think that finding a way of negotiating equivalences to give a EUDR stamp to a certification scheme that already works would be one way to go.
Agree completely.
Yep. I think that's a very good example of a national policy that actually achieves the EU's objective and probably does it more efficiently than what the EU is trying to do in the EUDR. But I think what's been missing is you don't have a venue where these types of examples and issues are actually put on the table and where you confront the European Union with the fact, listen, hey, guys, we can agree completely with your objective. It's just that there's different ways of skinning this cat. And it doesn't have to involve tariffs either, right? So there's this recognition, equivalence, identifying what actually is good practice and what works will be much more effective in actually achieving the objective than thinking about, oh, how can we use trade policy as a stick to beat countries over the head? But again, it goes back to this problem I have is that, so where is this happening? Where could this happen? Where should this happen? How do you bring those stakeholders together? And it might very well be that you should keep this out of the WTO because of this mercantilist kind of DNA that is embedded in the institution. Okay, so I think we are out of time. I'd like to thank everybody. Carolyn, thanks for being the punching bag presenting. I hope it was also useful to you. But obviously, there's a lot of concerns about some of the things that some countries are doing, which clearly you do not represent as you're an international civil servant. But I think it was a very useful and interesting discussion, which is kind of pointing us towards where hopefully we will end up, even if it is incrementally. So thanks again, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank
Nice
you.
to meet you all.
Thanks for all the thoughtful discussion.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.